Um, I'm Abby Rose. I'm the co-founder of Viticycle. We make apps that support observation as a key tool for understanding what works on a specific farm or vineyard. And many of you may already use or be familiar with our tool Sector which is our app specifically for vineyards. And Sector makes it easy to predict yields, monitor ripeness, understand soil health and biodiversity, as well as track vineyard activities block by block and much more. And more recently, we released what we call the Regen dashboard. That was in partnership with Nicole Masters. And that allows you to benchmark and track your regenerative viticulture journey using the 10 Regen indicators, as well as you can get tips and tricks from Nicole on how to improve them. So a little bit about the Regenerative Viticulture Series. At Viticycle, we're committed to building ecology, profitability, and beauty on farms around the world. And we're always exposed to amazing stuff that's happening on the ground. But in my experience, not enough people hear about that, especially the real implementation details of a regenerative approach. So this series is really about connecting the conversations, sharing knowledge, and highlighting the work of people on the ground, just like Tony here at Donum Estate and others, as brilliant resources if you do want to take a more regenerative approach. So please do ask any questions in the Q&A area. You can type it in there's a special Q&A box on Zoom, and it will be visible to everyone, and people can upvote, downvote. And we'll get started. So it's such a pleasure to be here talking to you, Tony Chapman. Tony has been focused on regenerative and organic from the very beginning of his career. We were just discussing how you started out at Tablas Creek. And you've worked with other places around the world, really pushing this regenerative approach, such as Forbes in Australia and others. And from the moment I met Tony, it was clear that you have a huge amount of experience trying many different approaches, and you've really built a system that's working well for you in your context at the Donum Estate. And so that's really exciting and inspiring to see. So yeah, Tony, please, welcome, first of all. And please do share a little bit about your current role and your background.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and speak with you. Yeah, so I grew up just south of Sonoma County in Fairfax, and so I've been close to wine country more or less my whole life. I am the head of wine growing at the Donum Estate, so overseeing 5 estate vineyards, all farmed regeneratively certified by the ROA, and oversee the wine production as well. And we have an incredible team with me. Abby, you've met a number of them, but what we're doing in the vineyards and on the winemaking side would not be possible without all of them. Started off Tablas and kind of worked my way around the world, Forbes, Moric, Bell Hill in New Zealand. And I started with Donum in 2019.
Great. And we'll dig into a few different aspects of it, but maybe we could start with focusing in on some of your tillage, tillage, min tillage experiments, because I know, a lot of people talk about this stuff, but not that many people do the experiments side by side like you have and get some real-time data. So maybe you could share a little bit about, what are those experiments, and then maybe some of the results you found so far.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So tillage has been something that I've been very interested in a long time. It seems to be probably like the most dogmatic aspect of this regenerative movement. There's quote unquote these like purists that say any amount of soil disturbance is the worst thing you could do. There's a well-known Italian agronomist that is encouraging people to use herbicide to terminate cover crop instead of tilling. And I've always looked at it with a lot of interest, and then I've always also thought, how is this impacting wine? Is this impacting the wine quality and the finished product? I think we talk about wine quality through really the lens of just being made in the winery in terms of whole cluster percentage, or how long the wine ages in barrel, percentage of new oak, native fermentations versus inoculated. But really, I always believe that the operations that are happening in the vineyard are ultimately driving the wine quality. So yeah, we set up several tillage trials. One of them was on a 3-acre block, 1 acre, 100% no-till, 1 acre minimal till, and then 1 acre kind of your conventional every other row tillage. And we tested a lot of kind of in-field data in terms of vigor, growth, shoot length, yield, of course, leaf water pressures. And then we picked them at the same time, fermented them separately. So we were able to get separate juice panels, aged them in similar oak, and then had to finish wine chemistry. And then we would taste them blind. And we tasted them blind with, several masters of wines and some really credible, reviewers and tasters. And one thing was certain, like the wines were different, right? And maybe that's not all because of tillage, but I do think that was, a main driver and a main factor in this. This specific trial, same rootstock across the block, same clone, same cover crop, same inputs. We try to treat everything in terms of our farming operation the exact same. With the one outlier being tillage. And so that kind of led me on to, okay, let's do this and bring in some more data and try to get some more empirical data to see how this is, really affecting soil health, vine health, and then ultimately wine. So we started a new trial on the opposite edge of our property. Same aspect of these two blocks. One of the blocks is minimally tilled, which means that it gets spaded once a year, and the other block 100% no-till. And both farm regeneratively, of course. The main difference is just this tillage event. Same rootstock, 3309C, same clone, Calera, same soil type. And then we partnered with agrology to get some really good data in terms of carbon flux and soil respiration, vapor pressure deficit, canopy temperature, soil temperature, humidity, things of that nature. And then we also started submitting Haney soil analysis. And the results were pretty staggering. We're going into our 6th season, and it's pretty amazing. Here in Carneros, we have pretty high clay content soils. They're smectic clay, so they have that shrink swell behavior. Farmed in agricultural settings, they tend to want to go very anaerobic. And I was told by a lot of growers, in this area that you simply can't farm no-till, which is maybe some of my motivation. But yeah, and I think it's something. We don't do a direct wine comparison on this new trial that we're doing. We pick them at separate times. We ferment them differently, different winemaking techniques. But I will say, the no-till block is one of the most compelling lots of this trial in the cellar every year, and it makes a large percentage makes it into a reserve wine, and we're really happy with what the wine is doing. How we've converted, I think, has been a big part of our story, with these clays especially. And like I said, we had 5 estate vineyards. The context is so different across those vineyards. Out on the true Sonoma coast, on our Bodega site, our Churchview vineyard, we have that gold rich soil, very loamy, and then all the way up in the north end of Anderson Valley, that's our Savoy vineyard, is very alluvial soils. So it's very different what we have here, and our approach here has been very different as well.
And I know we talked a little bit about, because some of the advantage of that live data was that you could see carbon dioxide bursts, and obviously we all know after tillage event you do get this burst of carbon dioxide. Maybe you could just share a little bit about that and some of the differences you saw, and how the plants can actually benefit from that.
Yeah, so we were measuring peak ground CO2, and the peak ground CO2 for the tillage block was, of course, right after we took the spader through, and it was just under 10,000 parts per million. And the no-till block, the peak ground CO2 was under 900 parts per million. And I think, we talk a lot about, in a lot of settings and systems, CO2 can actually be a limiting factor in terms of photosynthetic energy and efficiency. but at 10,000 parts per million, that's too much for the vines to utilize and take up. So they might be taking a tenth of that up, and then the rest of that is, lost to the atmosphere. One of the cool things that we saw with the data from the no-till block is the soils are respiring enough carbon for the vines to really utilize for high efficiency photosynthesis. And that they're essentially putting that carbon back into the soil through the liquid carbon pathway, and we're not losing all that carbon. When I look at that, when I look at that compared to our soil respiration and to our microbial active carbon percentage, I see a soil that has transitioned from chemical farming to one that's driven by biology.
Mm-hmm.
And that is just really, really efficient when I think of, soil function.
Mm-hmm. Really just its own like cycling just happening in front of your eyes, kind of, rather than bursting out into the atmosphere. And
Yeah, and like I think that word that you use, cycling, I think that's really important because this carbon is moving through the system, feeding the biology. It's not just accumulating. And so I think we talk about storing carbon, and that is important, sequestering carbon, but just as important as banking carbon is having that carbon move through the system, feeding that biology, and then ultimately feeding, the crop.
Absolutely. No, it's so cool. And I never really heard about research like that before, so it's so interesting to hear. Um, and maybe we could talk a little bit about, so on these kind of soils with a good clay content, how, many people are worried about going no-till, especially in a vineyard setting, because there's a lot of concern about loss of vine vigor or yield. And I know you said it was a bit of a journey to get there, and maybe could you share a little bit about, how do you go about preparing to go no-till, or how did you go about that? What does
Yeah.
that journey look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. For us, when I started with Donum, the soils here were fairly compacted. They were running, a heavy disc through the vineyard probably 3 times a year minimum. And so not only was there some surface compaction, but deeper down, if you're tilling repetitively, you're usually going to have a pretty hard pan compaction from 12 to 24 inches down. So one of the things when talking to growers, when they ask me what's something that I can do to help this transition, because you will see, effects of this soil transition on the vines early on, and later on as well, both negative and positive. But I recommend, thinking about doing a one-time, deep ripping, either sinking some shanks in or getting, an implement called a torpedo and getting it down there and really breaking up that compaction before you start thinking about biologically drilling and getting those cover crops in. And then also getting some oxygen down there. The soils in Carneros, like I said, they want to go anaerobic, and the fungi that we're trying to promote here, they need oxygen. And that's one thing that we've really seen shift is our soils go from bacteria dominated to fungal dominated. A couple of years ago, our soils, looking at our fungi to bacteria ratios, were all bacteria dominated year round essentially. And, now it's the complete opposite. So yeah, I think thinking about doing a one-time, deep ripping, sometimes it might take more than that, depending on how compacted your soils are and how deep you need to go, making sure that you're timing this at the right time so you're not doing, smearing or having any adverse effects. And then really start thinking about cover cropping. That's going to be the engine for all this largely. And then also trying to use biology as your friend. So trying to kind of inoculate your soils through compost teas or certain microbial inoculants and get that kind of biology restored.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, you mentioned the importance of the cover crops there. So I know you have done loads of experimenting and paying attention to cover crops. So maybe you could share a little bit about kind of how you go about choosing what cover crop to put where, and yeah, and how that works in that system as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, our cover crop looks, very different in Carneros than anywhere else, just because the soils here are so unique, and so much higher clay. The cation exchange capacity is so high. The one thing I would say is that our cover crops all have in common is diversity. We want to have a lot of biodiversity in the cover crop, and then we also want our cover crops to remain seasonally active. Those are kind of the two staples across our 5 vineyards that we put a lot of thought into. But yeah, I mean, I think for Carnero specifically, grasses can add a lot of structure. Oats are great for crimping. So in the no-till system, I think oats provide a lot of that good material to lay down to crimp effectively. Of course, legumes for nitrogen. I think these Carnero soils benefit from a lot of deep roots, getting that penetration down into the clay soils, not just to help water pathways and those aquaporins, but also to get oxygen into these soils, which is so important for these clay soils that do have that shrink swell behavior.
And I remember also you mentioned about certain crops can become kind of invasive over time and a real nuisance. And so I think you mentioned vetch is something that you no longer sow because for that reason, maybe you want to just comment on that.
Yeah, I'm probably a bit of an outlier with vetch. It's a great fixer of nitrogen. A lot of people use it. It's in a lot of common vineyard blends. I am like very sensitive to plants acting invasively. Whether you seed for it or not. There's a lot of cover crops that I want to try, and I'm always hesitant because I'm not sure how it's going to act. So always starting on a small scale, I think is the way to go when it comes to cover cropping. But yeah, I mean, with vetch, I've noticed just personally that it can act very invasively, and we're 8 seasons in now, and I haven't seeded vetch in 8 seasons, and I still see vetch. I still see vetch out in the vineyard. So yeah, I mean, it's at a population now where it's not acting invasively, but it's still there. And so I think if you're seeding vetch annually, it can take over things pretty quickly. One of the plants that my team is having a hard time dealing with right now, and again, like I might be an outlier on this. I think some people look at this as probably a benefit, but is the field marigold, and in the spring we have it everywhere. And when we graze sheep, they won't touch it early in the season. It doesn't have enough sugar content yet, and it goes everywhere. It actually can really outcompete young vines and young rootstocks. And it tends to grow under vine. I know some people like it under vine because it can outcompete, in theory, some noxious weeds. But like I said, when I see rows and I see it just overtaking the mid rows and under vine, like to me, that's acting invasively. To me, that's saying that, there's not a lot of balance in there. It's because a little bit of a single species crop, and so I want to avoid that. We have found that cows will feed on it during the season, and then the second pass of the sheep. This season we weren't able to get a full second pass, but the second pass, it seems that the sheep are more keen on it. And then by this time in the summer, it's not a big issue, but that's a specific plant species that it's tough to deal with because the seeds can stay viable deep down in the soil. So especially if you tried to till it in to eliminate it, you could be creating a worse problem just keeping all those seeds down in the soil bank. So don't want anything to act invasively in the vineyard. I put a lot of thought into what species to seed for that, and to keep things kind of in a natural balance.
Yeah, that makes sense. And certainly in the UK, a lot of people find some of the grasses can be what really take over in our climate. And it's a real issue here. So it's funny, every site is always a different story. And I guess that's what this is all about.
Totally. I've had growers, that I really respect tell me that they've seen daikon act invasively. I've never seen daikon radish, in my systems act invasively. But so I think, to your point, I think it's just so vineyard dependent.
Yeah, totally. And so one of the other facets that a lot of people use is compost.
Mm.
And I know certainly in an organic system, compost is often the key to being able to survive. And now you've moved more in your regenerative organic direction. I just was keen to hear a bit about your compost making, and I think you've been able to reduce the amount of compost you've been making, and where, where does it fit in the system today?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, compost, we've utilized it, from the start, from this transition, and it's been great. We make it ourselves on site. We partner with dairies in Sonoma County that are organic, and we get manure. We'll add some green manure as well to kind of feed that fungi. And then, to ensure that it's fungal dominant, we'll make sure that we have a lot of carbon-rich, woody material in there. Yeah, that's really important. Fungi are the primary decomposers of lignin, so having that source there is important. And also, we find that adding some of this wood material kind of helps the compost stay naturally aerated, just having more space. But yeah, this is the first year we've essentially have cut our compost production in half, and it's just because we need so much less of it. I think that's from the benefits that we're seeing of this farming system, where the vines are, essentially being fed continuously rather than in a more kind of conventional system. You're fertilizing and feeding the vines in these pulses, during root flushes, or, during bud break, or during flowering. You're kind of flushing the rhizosphere with nutrients and fertilizers. And, what we've seen now in our program is, I think largely because the vines have moved to this system of farming the microbes, and they're pulling them inside of their root cells, and they're stripping them oxidatively of their nutrients, and then they're expelling them back into the soil to recharge. And it's such a cool concept and idea. But we typically don't have, any large scale deficiencies, and we don't have any large scale, low vigor kind of areas. And so it doesn't really make sense for us to keep investing in that manure and building out that much compost. So we shrunk it quite extensively now. It's a little weird driving to the paddock that we have our compost production in, because it's half of what it used to be. It looks so empty and lonely. But yeah, I think it's ultimately kind of a result of the vineyards kind of becoming into this balance and really restoring the microbiome. But compost, we'll always make compost because it's so valuable to us on our estate, not just for the vineyards, but in our olive groves and our fruit trees and our gardens. I will say this, for young vines, we still utilize a lot of compost. And then we do, from time to time, have areas for certain reasons that might experience a little bit of low vigor, and we can go a little heavier there. But for the most part, I mean, really, even especially on our no-till blocks, vigor is not the issue for us. We have other issues in terms of, pest and set and things like that. But in terms of vigor, it's very, very few and far between. And I can think of a couple blocks off the top of my head that, are a little bit low vigor, but that's not typical for us. So it just, the vineyards aren't dictating that they need that much compost anymore. So we've cut back on that. But like I said, we'll always produce to some extent because there's so much value in it across the property and for the young vines, and using it in certain settings.
Of course. And have you done any experiments with compost extracts or compost teas and applying them more in that way, or?
Not necessarily experiments. I'm a big believer in compost teas. If our compost pile needs moisture, we'll never add just water. We'll always add it in the form of compost tea. For irrigation, very rarely will we add just water. We typically always add compost tea. We brew our compost tea in house. We have two 500-gallon brewers.
Nice.
So we're able to brew 1,000 gallons per 24 hours. It's super efficient. It's really easy to inject into the system. We can put it through the drip line. We can spray it on the canopy. We can spray it on the soil. So it gives us a lot of like flexibility. The only like kind of analysis we did early on is when we were kind of developing our kind of recipe for it. We sent out analysis in terms of fungi to bacteria ratios to make sure we were really propagating more fungi, and making sure we're adding enough, fifth hydrolysate and things like that to feed and target the beneficial fungi. But yeah, that being said, I haven't done anything like side by side.
No.
But a big believer in it. We'll use it for the compost. We use it for the vineyards. We use it for around the property. We use it to charge our biochar that we make here on site. Yeah.
Not amazing. And well, you mentioned that in some of your no-till blocks, not bigger, but sometimes there are other pressures, and you can have pest and disease management requirements. And I know we certainly get requests from people, especially in organic systems, asking for support and thinking through how do you deal with outbreaks when they occur. And so maybe we could chat a little bit about your approach to integrated pest management. And I know birds play a big role in your vineyard. And I know you've done some experiment, or not necessarily experiments, but you've been innovative in your approach there. And I'd love to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, to sum it up, like my approach to IPM is to have it robust as possible, and try to have resilience through that largely. Birds, I think, have been something really interesting that we've seen have a lot of benefit on the property. Whether it's kestrels, hawks, owls, of course, western bluebirds, swallows. So yeah, we have like a really healthy bird population here, and we've started to kind of think through how we can utilize them even more so in the vineyards. And the type of swallows that inhabit this area, they're mud nesting swallows. So they build their nest out of mud. And you've been to the property, so you know that a lot of the buildings here are white, and they make their nest underneath the eaves, and they create just like this mess, and mud's dripping down the buildings. And I just thought, like, okay, like these swallows target, moths and leafhoppers and all these things in the vineyard that can cause some issues. They can target certain caterpillars and cane borer beetles and so on and so on. So I was like, how can we get this population directly in the vineyard? And so I had this idea of making a faux eave and putting it in the vineyard. And we tried to get funding from Point Blue. And they said that they've never heard of anything like this, so they couldn't fund it, ironically. But we ended up taking it upon ourselves, and we made a very simple design. It's about 8 foot long, and two 2x4s, and then we basically just made what it sounds like a faux eave. And we're super excited. There seems to be a lot of bird activity around this. We're in the process of planting perennial natives underneath it. The shading effects from the structure in the vineyard is so marginal. I don't think it's going to impact anything. And in some ways, I think it could be a benefit if we ever do, this season get some more extreme heat. So yeah, I mean, it's something that we're interested enough in to, if we're successful with this, and then we see active nesting of the swallows, that we will probably figure out a way to incorporate this in our vineyard redevelopment and make sure that, we're planning for this in the infrastructure. Yeah.
Yeah, so exciting. And
yeah. It's a cool aesthetic too in the vineyard. People are like, what is that? I've never seen it before. And then
it gets
and explain it all.
good questions. Exactly. It gets people thinking.
Yeah.
And I guess it's interesting. I wonder curious in terms of your perspective on birds, because obviously, like in the UK, for example, I've seen people net their vineyards to keep the birds away, obviously, once the fruit is ripe. So how do you balance that in your mind?
Yeah. Unfortunately, netting as well.
Okay.
We don't net everywhere. Although you could probably make the argument we might in the future. In Carneros, the bird pressure is super high. We have a lot of starlings and the red-winged blackbirds. that go pretty hard. So we don't find that they're attractive to our white varieties. So we don't net any of the Chardonnay, but the Pinot Noir, they'll be on it like white on rice if it's not netted after veraison. So we don't net like our early picked Pinot Noirs that are going into sparkling and rosé. We tend to get those so early that we don't really see any negative impact from the birds. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the balance, right? And then, unfortunately, like some of these invasive species like starlings they really wreak havoc on the native Western bluebird populations. They disturb their nest and yeah, so I think like we're kind of balancing that by trying to create, more habitat for these beneficial birds in the system. And then the birds that we do consider pests in the vineyards, because there's certainly species that do act like pests in the vineyards. We combat them mainly with bird netting, and it would be great. It's, I think, everybody's least favorite job in the vineyard, putting on and taking off netting. It's so labor intensive. The nets are expensive. We use side paneling everywhere, so that's, there's really no way to mechanize that. We're doing that by hand every year. I'd love an alternative. I'm open to suggestions, but for now, that seems to be the way that we're handling that.
Yeah, and it's, as with everything, it's all a big balancing act. So
Yeah,
that's just part of it.
yeah,
And then so alongside obviously the birds acting and building this whole kind of biodiversity, your pest management system. But alongside that, of course, you still have your spray program. And I was wondering, how do you go about optimizing that? And yeah, maybe just you could say a little bit about that, and a little bit also about how you, late season sulfur sprays you really try not to do, and that you close down your sprayers very early, from what I can, in my experience. I'd just love to hear a bit about that.
yeah, totally. I mean, so a few things, like for our spray program, we have really utilized and seen the value in spore monitoring as a tool for us. So it's certainly not the be all end all, and that technology I think is getting a lot better. But we've been working with Root Applied Sciences and Scanit, two different spore monitoring companies that go about it in slightly different ways, and I think there's some benefits to each of them. But we found a lot of value in that, and helping us make these spray decisions in terms of intervals and in terms of material. For us, it's to optimize it. It's all about timing, canopy management, making sure that we're getting the crews in there, to open things up when we need to, in terms of lateral pulling and leafing. Biology plays a big role, making sure that we have a lot of diversity into the phyllosphere. So that kind of is where the compost teas play a really large role in. And then rotation. We're not trying to rely on a silver bullet. I think that is people that are looking for that it's just not the approach to take. Yeah, in terms of shutting down our sprayers early, like you mentioned. So I personally don't like late season sulfur. Some people do spray, sulfur maybe just post bunch closure. I don't like to spray it. I like to spray it right up until bunch closure. Typically not even that late. I just have seen that it has had some adverse effects on wine fermentations. It tends to push the wines really reductive, which kind of brings a whole nother bag of problems and issues. So I typically don't like spraying late season sulfur. Every season's like different. And of course, if the pressure's high, I can spray something. This season has been so difficult. In April, we had like some high temperatures in March, and then we had like, it kind of cooled off in April, and sulfur just wasn't really effective, because sulfur needs that temperature to really be activated. So I ended up spraying, oil and biologicals earlier on in the season, and then doing a sulfur spray right up until like basically right now in some of the vineyards, like up at Savoy, we're getting a spray on in the next 2 days, right before bunch closure. And then I'll switch back to biologicals, and then ultimately, if the season warrants it and I need something later, then I'll use usually oil. That being said, I do shut down the sprayers pretty early. If the fruit's clean and we don't have any active infection on the berries or the clusters, 8 bricks is what I target, and then I'll shut the sprayers down. If there is an infection, we can go a little bit longer. Powdery mildew can sporulate, if there's a previous infection, up until 15 bricks. So we'll go a little bit longer than that. We have been very lucky, and we typically have very clean fruit. And so we are able to get away with shutting down the sprayers, sometimes even earlier than 8 bricks, even at around 5 bricks. So it all depends on the seasons and the pressure, of course. I think, biologics are so exciting to use, and we use a lot of them. We make our own in the form of compost teas and spray them and utilize that. The one drawback towards biologics right now is that they're so expensive. Regalia is $94 a gallon in the US right now. Serenades, I think, like high 70s. And that's a real cost when you look at, sulfur and oil, and it just being pennies on the dollar compared to that. So I'm excited with some of these biological products. We're trialing a lot of different biologicals. We trialed a new one from AEA this year called Pinion, that I actually think was really, really effective. We do farm several blocks that we don't use any traditional fungicide. So we are only using biologicals on certain blocks. Again, the problem is the cost, the farming cost on that, it gets really high really quick. So hopefully, soon in the future, more of these biologicals will come to market, and it'll be more competitive. Pricing will get more competitive as well. In the meantime, I think like utilizing them in a rotation can be really effective. And then also, like I said, making our own. We will make our compost tea. Sometimes we'll add a little bit of a microbial inoculant that we source from into there, and before we spray it on the canopy. But yeah, I think timing, canopy work, biology, and rotation is how we kind of optimize our program. And our Pinot Noirs we ferment, and our Chardonnays, we ferment all with native yeast essentially. And so small portion of Chardonnay that we're still inoculating, but our Pinot Noir is 100% native fermentation, and it's really important for us to have a good understanding of what's coming in on the grapes. And I think that's where soil health plays a large role in as well. But this is where, talking about what we're doing in the vineyard affecting wine quality, I mean, I think it's really easy for most people to make that correlation. What you're spraying on the grapes and on the canopy is going to have an impact, not just on the vines, not just on the insects that are flying around, but also on the fermentation kinetics, potentially, flavors, what microbes are there and inhibiting the canopy and making it onto and they're making their way into the fermenters.
Absolutely. Yeah, that all makes sense. And it is interesting. Well, the biologicals have so much potential, but not quite or in the right. Yeah, they're just a different ballpark financially right now. So that makes sense how you're mixing it up.
Yeah, and the last thing on biologicals too is like I always try to have at least like 2 modes of action with them. So like I'll never just spray like one biological product. I always will try to get 2 modes of action in there, two different biologicals. That's where we've been able to do some cost savings with our compost tea in-house.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in a way, the compost tea. Or a vermicompost tea as well. They're meant to be so balanced biologically, and providing such a breadth of biology. So mixing that in feels like it would work well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we have a question or two here, but I'm just going to ask you a few more questions, and then I'll go to those. And if people do have further questions, then ask them in the Q&A, and I will be moving to those in the next 10 minutes or so. So I just wanted to focus a little bit on the 1 block challenge, because I know that you're part of the 1 block challenge in Sonoma. And I wanted to hear a little bit about, how is that going? And also, what have you learned so far? What are you doing in your 1 block, or what have you decided to focus on? Maybe it's the tillage trials. Yeah, I'd love to hear a bit about that.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm the Sonoma County lead for the 1 Block Challenge, which is an incredible initiative that the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation has launched. And it's incredible that California is kind of taking the lead on this. I mean, Santa Barbara, Temecula, Paso Robles, Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino. We have so many regions that are participating. I have a lot of pride in Sonoma, and I think Sonoma has a lot of rich history in farming consciously. So I hope that our region has really high participation and really good outcomes. But Sonoma's been fantastic. We launched April 16th. We did the first in-person field day at Donum, which was incredible. Sector Mentor played a great role in that. And then our second field day was just a couple weeks ago at Preston Winery, and Grayson Hartley led that, and that was phenomenal. We're going to have a third field day post-harvest, which we'll focus on kind of the effects of grazing and what that looks like. So that's to be determined in terms of where and timing. And if people are interested, go to the RVF website, and there's some great resources there, not just on the One Block Challenge, but on regenerative farming in general. But yeah, in terms of like what I've learned from it, I mean, really, I've doubled down and have seen firsthand how beneficial getting growers together, talking about their successes, their failures, their ideas. That's just been like so invigorating, so exciting to see, and it's so beneficial. So many people are thinking about these same problems and issues. People are having these really nuanced conversations about how to get higher seed germination rates and no-till blocks. What can you be doing, and this and that. How can you crimp more effectively? Our conversation about spraying, same thing. This year's been a really tough year. People have seen downy mildew. What are people doing to combat that? I saw Phomopsis out on the coast. Like, just using that kind of network that the RVF has kind of put together through the One Block Challenge has really been interesting, in a lot of ways valuable to driving a lot of these ideas forward. So it's been fantastic. Like I said, would encourage as many people to participate that are interested in this as possible. I think there's so much value in it. Yeah.
And it's interesting. One reflection I heard from someone who's a grower in Napa recently was just that so often, and I don't know if this is true in Sonoma as well, but so often people are only kind of in a position to show like their positive face and not really enabled to share kind of some of the failures because it's all part of the brand to be positive about everything. And that actually these spaces like the One Block Challenge are allowing for more of that. Authentic is the wrong. It's not that it's inauthentic otherwise, it's just that it's allowed to be more open. Because I guess it's not kind of a public forum as such, it's more about a grower forum.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. Like a practical example of this is, the last field day at Preston, Grayson was talking about, he wanted to, have higher rates of seed germination in his blocks that he's doing no-till. And I think anybody that's farming no-till want to increase that, right? I've tried ordering and seeding higher rates per acre. It's that kind of can be a challenge. And he talked to Jason Jardzine from Hansel, and Jason told him that he was using, putting a bunch of extra weight on the back of the cedar to, get the cedar deeper down. And it was like, oh, boom, just like that. Somebody tried something that worked, told somebody else. Grayson told this whole group of people. Everybody was like, oh, I'm going to try that. I mean, we're certainly going to try that this year on some of the blocks. And it was like a pretty simple solution. It's a solution I don't think will cost anybody anything, getting some, everybody has tractor weights and things like that to throw on. So yeah, I mean, I think that's just like one example of very practical outcomes of getting, growers together, producers together, and having these conversations. Yeah,
Absolutely.
and same on the wine side too. That's been really interesting. Like, that's something I think as much as the benefit that we've seen in terms of soil health and vine health, just health to the overall ecosystem, and these great metrics from carbon sequestration to canopy temperature. We have in our trial last year, we saw peak canopy temperatures, 13 degree Fahrenheit difference from no-till to minimal till. I mean, massive.
Wow.
Every winemaker in the state is interested in that. But I think that is interesting as that is, all those great things. Like I'm ultimately really interested in how this is affecting wine quality. So talking to these growers, like what they're seeing, talking the last field day, to Grayson, like how have you seen the wines change? And that's always super insightful to see, what people are seeing in their fermentations, in their élevage, in their blending, and ultimately the finished wines.
Totally. Yeah, I feel like maybe we don't talk about that side of it enough in a way.
Agreed.
Um,
I think we need to talk about it more and more. And I think it's harder because like, especially wine quality is so subjective.
yeah.
One of the things we're focused on is trying to get some more data. We're going to try to utilize a next generation sequencer this year and test the entire microbiome of our incoming grapes and try to gain some insights that way. But yeah, I think it's more difficult to kind of have empirical data in that regard.
Yep.
That being said, like I think, I've certainly made those claims and I stand by them.
Well, there you go. I'm
Yeah.
excited. I'm okay. I have a few more questions for you, but I am just going to ask a few the questions from people here, and then I'll go back to mine after that, if that's okay. So the first question was just from, it doesn't say who it's from, but it said, you've been talking about your no-till wine trials and wines tasting better potentially in those plots. Do you know if the soil or site would have been beneficial before the regen practices came into place? So I guess it's talking about, yeah, is the soil site what's causing some of those?
Yeah, I mean, great question. The soil's pretty homogenized through that block that we did that trial on. I think like that question is really interesting, and to almost like appease that mindset, you'd have to do this like in a greenhouse.
Hmm.
And like, Ted Lemon has this great quote that I love from Literati. And he said, I don't grow grapes in greenhouses. So could we, have done, and I tried to isolate more things, potentially. But like this is Mother Nature that we're dealing with. I always kind of caution it with saying that, this is winemaking, grape growing, it's a nuanced thing. There's a lot of factors. Is the differences that you're perceiving in this wine, is it all due to tillage? Probably not. Do I think that's one of the main drivers in this trial? Absolutely, right. I mean, the
Hmm.
wines all have this like very familiar thread, and they're all beautiful wines. And I'm not even going to make a claim one's better than the other. I do have a preference towards in this trial specifically towards the no-till. But when we present this to, journalists and things like that, it's never trying to push, this is better than this. It's mainly this is different. What do you
Mm.
prefer? My experience tasting this trial side by side, both blind and not, is that the no-till tends to be a little bit more compelling. It tends to have a little bit more depth and complexity to it. And then, people can make their assumptions off of that. I can certainly talk a lot about where I think that's coming from. But I at least think it's starting the conversation, and that's exciting for me.
Mm. And even your comment about the canopy temperature differences, I mean, that's going to have an effect on the grapes. So,
Massively, massively. I mean, that heat radiating in the tillage block, even the minimal till block, radiating off the soil into the canopy, volatilizing these delicate flavor and aromatic compounds, compared to, the no-till, really preserving that. Yeah, I think it's massive. I mean,
mm,
especially during these high extreme climatic chaos days that we get.
absolutely.
It's not incremental, that's for sure.
No, definitely not. Um, Great. And then another question is from Nick Gill. He's a grower who we've had on before, based in New Zealand. And he says, in New Zealand, we find perennial grasses under vine can dominate when we minimize tillage. So occasionally we have to clean them out, in inverted commas, and have a reset. We'd love to establish a population of plants under vine that coexist happily with the vines and suppress the bad weeds. Have you folks done any work with under vine living mulches?
Yes, we have. We have trialed white Dutch clover and buckwheat undervine. Um, it's hard to say. I think like getting them established is always pretty tricky. Once they're established, I think those two species have a lot of efficacy. We've done them together. We've done them separately. Um, The buckwheat was really interesting. I would like to try more. We have invested in undervine mowers, and we've seemed that to be pretty effective. That's interesting. We typically don't have perennial grasses that run too much of a rye under vine for us. We'll get other noxious weeds under vine that cause some issues for us, but and I think it's like living mulches are such a cool idea, right? Because
Hmm.
they're feeding the soil biology, they're keeping things covered, they're transpiring, like they're really kind of impacting the microclimate in the vines environment. We've also tried just regular mulch, so we have a long running hay trial that we put hay bales under vine, and that does an incredible job of obviously taking care of the weeds and retaining moisture. Obviously the downside with that is the labor to keep adding that on maybe not an annual basis, but probably at least a semi-annual basis, every couple of years. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's something that we're interested in. I think like with our grazing practices and like the equipment that we've invested in specifically for undervine, it's been something that maybe hasn't been quite a priority for us. But living mulches undervine, yeah, I think super interesting. We played around with them a little bit. We have like some native grasses that tend to go under vine, and they're annual, and they're great in the sense where right around now they're going dormant, they're dying. Um, we don't even really have to mow them. They're just kind of like flopping down and providing that cover. Um, so yeah, I know. I mean, I remember in Australia there was some issues that we had. It was like Kutch grass or something like that. It was like really invasive, and it got under vine, and it just like kind of wreaked havoc. Um, and I'm trying to think of how we dealt with it there. I think we used like a undervine cultivator and then put hay down to kind of snuff it out after that. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I've definitely heard of those kinds of issues under vine. Okay, great. And so I just wanted to um, ask a little bit, well, 2 points. One, what are you really excited about over the next couple of years in terms of this regenerative approach in the vineyard? And yeah, maybe we'll start there and then I have one more question.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm excited about a lot. I think I'm excited about that, like for the first time, I think in like a real way, tech is really integrating into vineyard systems. And like that's exciting because the technology is getting so much better, the equipment's getting so much better, things are becoming so much more efficient. Um, that's really exciting. I'm excited that, people are starting to have the conversation of why wines made from grapes farmed this way are different.
Mhm.
Um, whether that means that there's less inputs in the winery, whether that means they're more stable and they have more ageability, whether they're fresher, whether people like just putting their dollars behind something that's farmed like that. That conversation I think is starting. I think it's happening on a global level. I was in London in May, and people are starting to gravitate, I think, towards those wines. I think it would be really powerful if more consumers were asking for wines that were farmed and grown this way. Um, and that's probably what I'm most excited about is like kind of diving into that conversation.
Absolutely. And I know that one of the technologies you're experimenting with is the UVC vehicles out in the vineyard. Um,
Yes, we haven't. We're still in the GSI mapping phase on that. I'm really curious to try it this year, even though it's end of season. It's something that I've thought a lot about. I think anytime in like integrating something new into the farming system, it's always like a little nerve-wracking. How is like the vineyard going to react to it? How are the grapes going to react to it? Like how is it going to affect the wine ultimately? Trying to do as much research on UVC exposure to grapevines. What does it do to the cuticle and the berries? I mean, these berries are respiring right now. So like, what does that do to that? There's so many nuanced, kind of questions. What
mhm.
is it? I don't want the phyllosphere to be sterilized before harvest and then have like, such low populations of, Saccharomyces and all these other non-sac yeast and things like that. So, I think like I'm excited because if it works, well and it's effective, how cool. And then also like hesitant to go all in because like what impact does this does this have? So I think, always trying to integrate new technology on small scale first before rolling it out. So we have one robot on site. Hopefully we'll get it up and running end of this week, probably next week. And then we'll start running that, 4 to 6 nights a week and kind of seeing, what observations we have. We have the spore monitors out there, so seeing what populations are doing to the best of our abilities, at least. Yeah, but I'm excited to see where this technology takes us.
Mm. And I think one thing that's very cool about you in particular is that you're very good at well, because it seems like of many of the viticulturalists and vineyard managers I've met, you think a lot more about the wine side than some, and how that in quite a lot of detail and quite scientifically. And I think, it's the different trials you're running and how you're going about this. It feels like it's a huge benefit to so many of us to learn from you. So I just wanted to highlight that and say thanks, and thanks for sharing all of that today. Because I mean, I know it's a lot of work. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it
Well,
doesn't
thank you. I
just
appreciate
happen.
that.
And
Yeah, it's not just habit. No,
no,
and that's where my incredible team comes into play as well, kind of coordinating a lot of this and making sure that's happening and it's happening effectively and up to our kind of standard operating procedures. And yeah, so
totally. No, it's brilliant. So
yeah,
I really
appreciate.
appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And also very exciting that you're kind of leading the One Block Challenge in Sonoma, because that approach is just so core to some of the benefits of the One Block Challenge as well.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so we've got 2 minutes left here, so I'm just going to close out. I don't know if there's anything else finally you want to say or you're good to go?
Yeah, just thank you so much for having me on. It was a lot of fun. I love, chatting with you and your team about what we're doing in the vineyards and the wines that we're creating from that. And yeah, so always just a pleasure to speak on this topic to you. And Sector Mentor's been great for us. We love the Regen dashboard and so many of the other tools that we're able to utilize. So
Mm.
yeah.
That's brilliant. Well, we are always enamored with with Donum Estate and all you guys are doing. So it's a pleasure. So thank you so much. Thank you also everyone listening and for your questions. It's been brilliant. And we will send a follow-up email. It won't be in the next 2 weeks. We just have a little holiday break for some people. So it'll actually come out in the first to second week of July. Is when the video recording and the links will all be released. And we'll send links of where you can find out more about Tony and what you're doing at Donum Estate, as well as the One Block Challenge. And then you can also sign up to our Regenerative Viticulture Simplified course. And that's a 7-day deep dive into what it means to take a regenerative approach. And what we, at Viticycle have learned is most effective from many different practitioners, including Tony. And then to see previous episodes in the series and to access amazing practical insights from everyone who's been part of this Regenerative Viticulture series so far, please do head to the Regen Viticulture Hub, which is also on our website. I think Inti posted some of the links in the chat, so you can see them there. And that's all from us. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day wherever you are in the world.